Welcome to InnoEthics Live, hosted by Allegra and Daria, and produced in conjunction with the InnoEthics Initiative and the Be the Change Media Network. On this podcast, we discuss topics within AI and emerging technologies, focusing on subjects such as governance and ethics, cybersecurity and privacy, and autonomy in a digital world, and the impacts of emerging technologies generally.
By combining a philosophical humanitarian perspective and a technical scientific one, the aim of the podcast is to discuss these global issues from a point of view that takes into consideration the many facets of these discussions.
Coming from different backgrounds, both on our focus subjects, but also from different countries, and having met at a conference that celebrates youth global cooperation, Daria and I seek to emphasize the importance of a global perspective on these topics. In our previous episode, we interviewed our first guest, Sophia Baxter, on what reflected AI is and everything about it. Make sure to go check out that episode. Starting off with this week's episode, Daria's going to share her fun fact for the week.
For the past few weeks, we've talked about AI as a creator, how it writes poetry, composes symphonies, or even how it's helped us vibe code securely. Today, our fun fact is different. In VR and AR, AI isn't just a brain in a box. It's finally getting a body. What are VR and AR, though? For the people who don't know, the easiest way to think about it is a question of location. Virtual reality, or VR, is a teleporter in a sense. Or the analogy that we can use, it's if we imagine putting on a pair of magical sleep masks. When you open your eyes, you aren't in your living room anymore. You're on a beach in Hawaii or a space station. VR replaces your world entirely. It's for when you want to go somewhere else. Just chill, relax, or discover something new.
Talking about VR is sending me, I'm getting nostalgia flashbacks to 2014, 2015, to when I must have been 9, 10 years old. And I think we got one of those Google Cardboard VR headsets where you just folded it into the shape of the headset. And put your phone in with a software, a split screen software, and boom, you are underwater in some submarine looking around and swimming with the fish. And I remember just being like, oh, wow, this is so cool. And yeah, it's kind of crazy. It's been around for so long, and it really is like a transportational thing. I love the teleporter analogy to it.
Thank you, Allegra. It does take me back as well. And I also got nostalgic about it because recently I've had a lot to do with VR in many of my labs. So taking me back to 2014, 2015, it's such a full circle moment.
Actually, Daria, could you talk to us a bit about how you're using VR in your course? That's so interesting to hear.
Well, in my university, I've been using VR either for user studies from university researchers or for my courses. In my courses, I've had to view how VR could become better in terms of usability principles, in terms of user preferences, in terms of appearance, in sense of how it looks and how it can be more realistic. But that's as far as I've gone on until now. Excited to see what's up next. Hopefully, I'll get to program something in the VR world.
That sounds super interesting. And it's great hearing the diverse use of technology you're using in your course. Now, why don't you tell us a bit about AR and what that is?
So AR is augmented reality. It is basically a magic highlighter. Think of it as wearing clear glasses that can draw on the world. You can still see your kitchen table, but now somehow there's a digital instructions manual floating right above your toaster. Or imagine a virtual cat sitting on your real rug. AR stays in your world, but adds layers to it. A current use for it that I can actually think of, it's how IKEA has AR integrated in their systems, and how you can see different furnitures in your room or in your kitchen or anywhere in your home, and how it would look like in real life.
And it's really useful as a technology as well, that, especially that example with IKEA. An example that I guess I'm more familiar with, it's used in quite a bit of gaming, and app games like on phones and iPads. I think to differentiate themselves, certain games a few years ago, I remember would start introducing AR features where you could play the game in your reality, like virtually, but in your actual room, which I think is quite a cool concept. But yeah, definitely a more useful concept would be, for example, how IKEA is using it. Daria, I'm now really curious to hear how is AI going to fiddle this?
Well, if we consider VR and AR as eyes or ears of the experience, AI is going to be the brain that makes everything work and like everything makes sense. Without AI, VR and AR are just pretty pictures. With AI, they become smart. Let's think of AI as a translator. In the past, you've had to click on buttons to do things. Or, for example, in VR, you've had to use the hand remotes. Now, AI watches your hands and eyes. So it's like having an attentive butler. You don't have to shout, turn the page, or bring me a glass of water. You just have to point at it. You just have to glance at the corner of a virtual book or glance at the glass of water. And the AI, sensing your intent, turns in for you. Another way to see how AI can be integrated into VR and AR is as an architect. In VR, AI can build worlds on the fly. It's like choose your own adventure book that writes itself while you read. You tell the AI, make it sunset, and it instantly repaints the entire sky and changes shadows on the ground to match. You can also think of AI as the librarian. In AR, for example, AI looks at the real world and explains it. So you can imagine looking into a complex car engine. The AI identifies the parts, like a librarian finding a book, and labels them in 3D right before your eyes. It doesn't just see the metal shapes, but it also understands that it's a spark plug.
All this is sounding very almost science fiction like.
It kind of is, but it's very encouraging because it makes technology more human. Instead of having to deal with a computer, you're dealing with it in the physical world. So for decades, we've had to learn the language of computers, like typing, clicking, filing, programming in different languages. But because of AI, these new headsets are learning our language. They are learning to understand how our gestures, our voices, and our physical spaces are. Why do I find this interesting and why do I think you guys will too? It's all because what I said earlier, we're moving away from using computers and towards living with them in a way that feels natural.
Definitely. I think that point on living as they become even more integrated kind of highlights why the subjects we talk about on this podcast are so important, because as they become a larger and larger part of our living reality, we're going to be needing really robust and thought through ethical frameworks and regulatory frameworks, which are allowing us to take the best positive interactions we have with them, the best positive capabilities that these technologies have, but putting them into our society in a way that's meaning that everyone is protected and no one is going to be falling harm to any negative consequences. And I guess that nicely leads us on to another very real use or use of in our daily real lives of technology, which is today's topic of facial recognition technology, and also touching upon deepfake and live facial recognition users. So if we start talking about facial recognition technology, let's think about how you recognize a friend in a crowded room. You don't look at the exact distance between their eyes or the exact length of their nose or the exact shape of their lips. Your brain just knows it's them. You don't have to recognize it with numerical or mathematical measurements. Facial recognition technology is basically a computer's attempt to do the same trick of recognizing a face, but instead of using intuition, it does use this mathematical component. To start off with, Daria is going to be explaining the different steps in how this facial recognition technology works.
Thanks, Allegra. So step one is detection and alignment. First, the computer has to find a face in an image. So We can think of it as thinking at a messy desk. You have to ignore the coffee mug and the stapler to find your phone. That's detection. Once it finds the face, it has to straighten it out. If you take a selfie from a low angle or while tilting your head, the computer performs alignment. So basically, it's like a passport photo booth. It virtually grabs your head and makes sure you're looking straight ahead. So the measurement starts from the same baseline every time. Moving on to step 2, the embedding. Now is, let's say, the secret sauce. The computer doesn't save a picture of you. That would just take up too much memory and be too hard to search. Instead, it turns your face into a long string of numbers called an embedding. Think of it like a recipe. Instead of remembering what a cake looks like, you remember 2 cups of flour, 3 eggs, 1 cup of sugar. If another cake has those exact same ingredients, it's the same type of cake. The computer turns your features, this distance between your eyes, the curve of your jaw, the shape of your lips, into a unique numerical recipe. Going on to step 3, the matching. Finally, the computer has to decide if the recipe is just created, it's matching to one it already has in its cookbook or the database. And for this, it uses something called a similarities threshold. It's like a bouncer at the club. The bouncer has a list of names, and the person standing in front of them looks 99% like the photo on the ID, they let them in. If they only look 70% like it, maybe because of bad lighting or heavy beard, the bouncer says, no match. It's never a yes or a no for the computer. It's always a how close are we?
I was wondering if you had a list of images that you were trying to match up to person A, for example, and you had 6 or 7 images of potential people who could match up to person A, would the computer rank them or give you this person is a yes or no match, then the next person is a yes or no match?
If you're trying to find the person that's most like person A, it's going to rank them and focus on number 1 person that's closest to person A. But it's not going to give you a yes or no, this person matches person A or not. It can give a percentage rather than a 100% chance.
And that focus on the accuracy is something that we're going to be talking about when we consider the ethical considerations of the technology.
And I'm so looking forward to hear your take on this in the philosophical sense of the topic. But continuing on with why facial recognition is still hard, it's because it's not foolproof. At least not yet. It's still learning though. Just like humans, it can be fooled by very good celebrity impersonators or an identical twin, let's say. Computers then can struggle with the liveness. They can be taught to tell the difference between a real, breathing human and a high-resolution photo held up to a lens.
And on that note, we're going to have a look at some of the ethical considerations of facial recognition technology. So, as Daria was saying, you need to use huge data sets of human faces in order to train these AI models. And this is a foundation upon which facial recognition and deepfake technology are built on. Looking first at facial recognition technology, one of the biggest and most mainstream ethical concerns is the concern of inaccuracy and demographic bias specifically. So research highlights that facial recognition technology is not a neutral tool in the same that there are biases present through its usage, similar to how we were discussing bias in the machine using biased data sets in our last couple of episodes. Its accuracy can fluctuate based on who is being scanned, and there is evidence that algorithms are significantly less accurate when identifying individuals of certain race or gender demographics. For example, the National Institute of Standards and Technology found that many algorithms are, and I quote, 10 to 100 times more likely to misidentify Asian and Black faces compared to white ones.
You got it.
Examples such as these show the serious ethical questions here for the consequences of data bias, resulting from datasets used for training that lack diversity and overrepresent certain groups while underrepresenting certain groups. with the most significant ones for facial recognition technology being underrepresenting of people of color, women, and younger or older age groups. Like I said earlier, this links back to our previous episode where we discussed how datasets lacking sufficient diversity of data can reflect existing societal prejudices, which are then amplified by AI systems. The consequences of this can be that in a criminal context, for example, which is where facial recognition technology, especially live facial recognition technology, is being mostly piloted and used currently, is that false positives can lead to false interventions where innocent individuals are wrongly tagged by law enforcement. There have been multiple high-profile cases in the UK and the US recently that have shown examples of false positives leading to people being wrongly arrested or investigated because this technology is still presenting certain inaccuracies, which are affecting people. Certain inaccuracies which are affecting people from these underrepresented categories disproportionately compared to those overrepresented. One of the major ethical concerns in terms of this technology and politics is that the use of facial recognition technology at political demonstrations might deter people from exercising their right to protest or speak out. An example of this resulted in a landmark case in 2023, where the European Court of Human Rights ruled that using facial recognition technology to identify and arrest a peaceful protester was a breach of the right to private life and freedom of expression. Another example which has caused mixed reception has been the rollout of live facial recognition technology across the UK in various different capacities. This includes the Home Office funding live facial recognition bans across 7 additional regions of the UK in summer 2025, and introducing the first fixed camera live facial recognition pilot in Croydon, a London borough, which, as of January 2026, has resulted in the arrest of more than 100 wanted criminals. Moreover, in November 2025, live facial recognition technology was officially adopted for immigration enforcement at ports across the UK. However, following all this, there have been calls that current legislation involving the protection of biometric data and GDPR laws do not adequately currently cover the regulatory necessities posed by live facial recognition technology, especially when police forces can now access the database of the general population's passport photos in order to aid their usage of the technology. Therefore, currently, as of time of recording, a major legal consultation on facial recognition technology usage has been launched by the UK government with a deadline set for February 2026. There are some people who are really leaning towards the fact that this technology has had a positive impact at reducing levels of crime in the areas where it's being piloted and leading to the arrest of wanted criminals. However, at the same time, there have been reports that people are afraid to leave their house, especially when they know they are a part of the demographics that are often being flagged up in terms of false positives, and therefore are concerned that they could be incorrectly targeted. There have been calls for this consultation also to look at and enforce rules on private technology companies which are designing and implementing the technology. However, these companies at the moment are really unsure as to where to stand on the usage and dissemination of the technology, especially without very clear guidelines in many countries. If we take an example of the EU AI Act and how the regulation looks there, the Act prohibits the use of real-time remote biometric identification systems in publicly accessible spaces by law enforcement, and also bans AI that scrapes facial images from the internet or CCTV to create databases. Only in exceptional cases, when strictly necessary, authorized by a judicial or administrative body, can live facial recognition technology be used. For example, in cases such as searching for victims of abduction or trafficking, preventing imminent threats or terrorist attacks, or identifying suspects of serious crimes.
So, Allegra, which version do you like more? The one that the UK is using or the one that EU? Or would you rather not have facial recognition in public spaces at all?
What we can see with the two examples is that there can be advantages to the use of this technology, especially in terms of the serious crimes that the EU Act suggested, such as helping victims of abduction or trafficking or preventing imminent threats. And we can see that in the case of where the UK is rolling out its pilots, there have been positive results, such as in just the last 6 months since pilots have been released, the arrest of 100 wanted criminals, over 100 wanted criminals. However, at the same time, I think while there are still inaccuracies to a fairly high level of the technology, there really needs to be some consideration as to whether these outweigh potential for targeting incorrect people as a result of false positives, whether these outweigh the usage of it. And what I think is fairly positive is the fact that when this technology was first started being talked about, even like 5-6 years ago, it was significantly more inaccurate and has since become, with the technology improving, a more reliable piece of tech. However, we also really do need to take into consideration that a lot of the data sets, people are not consenting to have their passport photos used for the training of this data in the example of the UK police. And they can't choose to opt out of it. And there needs to be some serious considerations as if being a citizen of a country, do you immediately allow for the police force to use your information in that way? For example, when you enter a new country, you are expected in many cases to provide your biometric data through fingerprints. This is a similar example. This is if we are entering a scenario where there is this immediate allowance of it when you decide to apply for a passport and upload a photo of yourself, should people have more of a say in that? And if so, to what extent? Wrapping up this part on the ethical considerations of facial recognition technology is the flip side of the discussion. Daria, why don't you tell us a bit about deepfake?
Well, deepfakes are the other side of the facial recognition coin. While recognition is about detecting, identifying, and matching a face, deepfake focuses on generating or swapping one. So let's take some examples. How many times have we seen videos of celebrities saying something they never actually did? And what about historical video figures brought back to life in some sort of way through something they supposedly said? These are deepfakes. The names comes from deep learning and fake. Sliding a bit into the technical side, most deepfakes are created using the GAN, or rather generative adversarial network system. The system uses two models, the generative model, known as the generator, and the discriminative model, known as the discriminator. The generator is the creator of the images. We can think of it as a brilliant and patient art forger. His only goal is to paint the perfect copy of a masterpiece, basically the face of a celebrity, for example. I said patience because the painting can first start as blurry and not so perfect, and then it needs to move into a perfect one. This is where the discriminator comes in, the checker or the detective. Its job is to see the artwork and decide whether it's real or fake. As the system is a deconvolutional neural network, or an AI model that operates as a reverse convolutional neural network, CNN, primarily used for image synthesis, segmentation, and feature visualization by reconstructing high-resolution detailed maps from low-resolution feature representation. It works based on adversarial search, specifically a minimax sort of game, or in simpler terms, a training loop with two players. Using our earlier analogy, each player, the forger and the detective, does its part. The forger creates the paintings, the detective gives feedback on creating more realistic work, and this makes the forger go back and enhance what he already has. This loop happens a lot. It's not a one and done deal. It takes a lot to create a perfect image, let alone a perfect fake video. It becomes so perfect that the detective can't tell the difference between the real and the fake. However, when creating a video, the face needs to move. So what the AI model needs to do is to use motion transfer or puppetry. To make the video, the face of a person is put on a digital mask on a real actor. Whatever the actor does, the mask does as well. Whether it's smiling, blinking, crying, or anything. We can say that this digital mask works even better than the snapshot filters we might use when taking photos or videos, as it doesn't add, but it fully replaces every single pixel of the skin, the shadows, and the reflection. Can we notice it though? Whether it's real or fake? Maybe before, in the early start, it was easier to notice on a front side, but now it's quite hard to distinguish deepfakes with a free eye. Can we notice it though? Maybe before, in the early start, we could have been able to distinguish deepfakes from something real with a free eye, even if we saw it the front face. But even now, it can be done though, but not through just with a picture of the frontal view. Most likely, we can see it in the side profile or if a hand goes in front of the face.
And I think this ability to distinguish, Daria, comes also in terms of being able to differentiate between AI generated images and videos. Every time this discussion comes up, like how can we distinguish between what's been modified by AI technology and what's actually real? I always think about one of my favorite philosophers who focuses on AI, whose name is Jonathan Birch. And when I saw him in London last year, he said one of the things we can do to stop this anthropomorphization of AI is kind of making it just that little bit uncanny to stop our brains thinking this is real. And this is applicable to how we interact with LLMs and chatbots, and also just keeping that slight uncanniness of AI generated media and deepfake, because that will allow us to be able to distinguish it much easier with just a free eye or just by looking at it. Because otherwise it can be quite concerning. Well, obviously, creators and developers do want to make their AI, part of them do want to make their AI as realistic and as passable as possible. In order to stay safe from the potential harmful implications of AI anthropomorphism, I think having this kind of like uncanniness could be a really good way. But it is something that we'll see trying to get removed more and more as facial recognition technology, deepfake, and AI generated content continues to be developed.
That's a wonderful point, Allegra, and I like it. Unfortunately, though, I don't see the industry going in a way of creating uncanny images, because the way, at least up until this point, we worked as humans, it's been trying to get as close to the real thing as perfect as possible. So while that's a great point, it's going to be hard to go to, at least before we reach that perfectness.
Yeah. And then maybe scaling it back from that point.
Exactly.
Until then, Daria, what's the solution? How are we going to be able to differentiate from what's been edited? And
Yeah, so this year, the industry is moving towards digital watermarking. So the most legitimate cameras and AI tools embed the content credential into the file's metadata. It's like a digital DNA test. It proves whether the pixels were captured by a lens or a computer. So that's supposed to help us compare whether something is fake or real, created by an AI or by a cameraman.
that's so interesting. And I think all of these points are really proving towards something that I recently read actually in the BBC, where a lot of the content that is coming out from various places of conflict around the world at the moment, news organizations are really struggling with being able to differentiate what's been modified with AI and what's not. And using tools such as digital watermarking is going to allow these organizations from being able to ensure that they're disseminating information that they are sure of hasn't been tampered with or modified with AI in any way and is genuine. Now, looking at the ethical side, just as facial recognition technology raises concerns about surveillance and bias, deepfake also presents various ethical considerations. So the first ethical consideration that I want to talk about is the non-consensual exploitation and digital violence rising from this use of deepfake. So this is something that I imagine is very present and mainstream in the forefront of a lot of people's minds since recent events that have happened in the last couple of months. But this is the most pervasive and present concern of deepfake, as it's a clear breach of people's digital protection and privacy. And in terms of deepfake being used as a tool for digital undressing and the production of non-consensual intimate media, there is substantial research from UK universities conducted last year that shows that the vast majority of all deepfake content found online is pornographic, and almost 99% of that content is created without the subject's consent. And concerns of these kinds were brought very much to light in January 2026, earlier this year, through the highly publicized case involving the Aurora model on the Grok AI platform. And by using specific requests to get around the guardrails of the platform, after it's been shown that guardrails were limited because the AI was considered too restricting, these guardrails should have stopped the generation of images of a sexual or intimate kind. However, the result of their reduction, users were allowed to generate over 3 million sexualized images of real people in just 11 days, with the vast majority of these being women and a great number being sexualized images of children. The result of this was multiple countries banning the platform outright, calling for increased regulation of platforms of these kind, and has led the way to countries, including the UK, making the creation of non-consensual intimate images with AI a criminal offence, something that was not specifically covered in previous online safety acts. The example of Grok showed the importance of proper regulation in place to restrict unethical or problematic use of AI platforms by bad actors in order to protect people from the potential harmful uses associated with the technology. Alongside the possibility of non-consensual media being produced by this technology, there is also a large political threat associated with this tech, with us already being in an era where people already doubt the information they read or media they consume because of the possibility of it being AI generated or modified using technology. Deepfake presents a whole other dimension to that, with fears about what's being said by celebrities, by politicians, by other public figures, and whether people can actually take that at face value. This has the potential to undermine the foundation of democracy and the ability of society to agree on what are facts and who can they listen to, and if the people they think they can listen to are even actually the ones saying what they're saying, or if it's just someone else's image or someone else's voice put on a different set of words. Furthermore, constant exposure to media leads to a sort of information fatigue, as voters need to distinguish truth from fiction. And this can lead to people not wanting to be politically engaged because it's so tiring having to constantly second guess, is what I'm seeing real? And this is where Daria's point about digital watermarking in the verification of content is super important. Lastly, as well as there being risks in politics and the public sphere, as well as the consensual element to it, there's also a big consent vacuum in how data sets are being used to train this AI and this technology. Similar to facial recognition technology, massive data sets are required to build deepfake models, posing similar ethical concerns to the development of that technology. And because most generative models are trained off images scraped from social media and public forums, without the individuals providing consent for the use of their face to become a part of this system, this is all happening without people's knowledge.
Talking about these consent forms about AI training, how do you view it in terms of people using apps, consenting to their user agreements, but not actually reading what these user agreements entail when they could very much mention that they're going to be using images people upload in these apps? What's your opinion on that, Allegra?
I think, honestly, it's everybody knows that no one reads the T's and C's. I think if we're looking at it completely practically, people should read their user agreements, and people should read things before they tick. Yes, you can take X data, you can take Y images, and you can use that for whatever purposes, and people should be reading that. However, I also think that realistically, companies know and developers know and governments know that people aren't reading these things. And I think there does need to be a bigger highlight that this is a way that their data could be used. Because I think people would feel much more strongly about their image being and their face being used to train technology, as opposed to, for example, their cookies being used and sold to advertising companies, or specific habits they have when online shopping, and that being used as training data. I think people would feel much more strongly about how their about how their facial and biometric data is being used. And therefore, I think this is something that, because a lot of people aren't even aware that it's happening, and as a result, I think it's something that needs to be highlighted much more clearly than it currently is. And in the example of facial recognition technology, especially live facial recognition technology, when there is the deployment of it being used, for example, one time when I was walking in London, the use of live facial recognition technology on a van was being deployed on Tottenham Court Road, which is one of the busiest roads in London, especially at the intersection with Oxford Street. And it's a very common place for people to get pickpocketed or for theft to happen. And as a result, that is a place where live facial recognition technology could have a really positive impact at reducing levels of crime. However, there was also a huge sign saying this technology is being used here. We are the Met Police. Everything is being done. It was being done in a transparent way to an extent. And I think telling people that this technology is happening is something that's so essential because, like I said before, a lot of people aren't aware that massive data sets are scraping images from what you think is your private social media account might not actually be private to the extent that even photos from that social media account aren't being used. So therefore, while I think, again, it's very important everyone reads their user agreements and the T's and C's before just clicking yes blindly, I also think that there's a very practical understanding that a lot of people don't, and as a result, there needs to be more awareness that this is happening.
So, Allegra, what you're saying is that these companies need to make it more noticeable what they're going to be using from user content, right? But if they're mentioning it on their user agreement, do you think it's up to the companies that are following the rules based on GDPR or whatever policy-making organization there is, and whether they have an ethical
obligation?
Thank you. Whether they have an ethical obligation to make it more known?
I think this is where there needs to be stronger regulation, especially in terms of, and this is what the consultation in February, at least in the UK, hopefully will come up with more answers for, but then and more solutions for. But I think currently the argument is that current biometric and GDPR rules do not cover enough in order to protect people from the use of facial data not being exploited. And hopefully with clearer rules, that will also provide a more defined set of guidelines to how companies and developers need to communicate to users that this is a way that their data could be used.
Well, thank you, Allegra, for the information and your views that you just shared. Now it's time to wrap up with episode 6 of the InnoEthics Live podcast, hosted by Allegra and Daria, produced in conjunction with the InnoEthics Initiative and the Be the Change Media Network.